Alright, in this lesson I'll show you how to export data frames into an Excel file or an Excel workbook. So let's begin by executing our code to load our baby names data from the internet. And to keep things interesting, I'm going to export one Excel workbook, but I want it to include two separate worksheets. In order to do that, I'm going to want to make two data frames here. So I'm going to split this original baby names data frame into two based on the gender column. So let's create a boys data frame and a girls data frame. So I'll begin by extracting my baby names gender column in square brackets. There it is. And of course, to perform a simple filtration, we can just use the double equal sign. That's going to give me a Boolean series of trues and falses depending on if the value is equal to female. At that point, I can put this in square brackets after my data frame name, and there I'm going to get a new data frame, a subset of my original that represents all of the rows where the value is female in the gender column. So I'm going to assign this to a variable called girls, and I'm also going to copy this code, put on the line below, and just change these values to boys, both for the variable name here and this I'm going to change to male. And so now we're going to have two data frames that we basically exist as a subset of our original data frame. So now let's go ahead and show you the process of how you export to an Excel file. Now this is actually going to be a bit more complex than the simple export to a CSV file. What we first have to do is create an Excel writer object, and you can think of this as the foundation for a workbook. So simply creating the Excel writer object does not actually save the file or export any kind of Excel file. It just builds the foundation. You then add the data frames to that Excel writer object, and finally you save it, and that's what actually exports the workbook. So let's take a look. The Excel writer object is found directly on the pandas library, or rather the constructor method that creates an Excel writer object. So I'm going to do pd dot, and I'm going to search for ex and press my tab here, and I want this Excel writer option. So it is a method, so it does require parentheses, and the only argument I'm going to give here is the name that I want to provide my Excel workbook file. So this is the entire file as a whole. So I'm going to call it baby names, and we do have to include the extension just like we do with the toCSV method. So an Excel workbook extension is XLSX. So there I have it. Now when I execute this, I'm not going to get anything here. You can see just a pandas object. If I go back to my Navigator view, you'll see that the baby names XLSX file has not yet been generated. So we haven't created anything yet. We've just formed the foundation. And we'll have to use this foundation when we're telling our data frames that we want them to serve as the worksheets in this central Excel workbook. In order to do that, we'll need to be able to reference this Excel writer object. So I need to preserve it in a variable. And I'm just going to call that variable Excel file. So just to remind you, this is my variable name. This is a total random arbitrary value. It doesn't have to be Excel file. It can be whatever you'd like. I just like to call it Excel file because that's basically what it is. It's the entire workbook as a whole. That's what you can think of it as. Now I'm going to execute this and move on to the next step in the process. So this is where I decide what data frames I want to add to my workbook, or in this case my Excel writer object. So let's begin with girls. And now I'm going to call the toExcel method on it, just like we did with the toCSV method. Now if I put my parentheses here for the method and check out my documentation with Shift Tab, I'll see that the very first parameter here is actually going to be Excel Writer. So basically Pandas is asking us for the foundation object that it should use as this kind of the place where it's going to place this data frame. So the workbook where we want to store this girls data frame is going to be this baby names workbook that is currently stored in the Excel file Excel Writer object. So I'm going to put Excel file here as my variable name. That's going to reference this object that we created right here. And then I'm also going to provide an argument for the sheet name parameter because that specifies what the actual worksheet name is going to be within the Excel workbook. So I'm going to write the parameter out, sheet name, and I'm going to call it simply girls. Finally, just like the toCSV method, the toExcel method by default includes the index of the data frame. And in this case, since it's just going to be numeric, in fact, it's going to be scattered because we took a subset of the original data frame, so those index values are going to be all over the place. I'm going to exclude it from our export, and the way I do that is by providing an argument of false to this index parameter right here. So I'm going to switch the default argument. It is true, and I'm going to switch it to false, and that's all we need to do for the girls data frame. And then it's basically repeating the exact same process for our other data frame, which is boys. So here's our data frame. I'm calling the exact same toExcel method on it. And once again, it's going to expect an Excel Writer object. And once again, it's going to be the same workbook. It's going to be the baby names workbook that we currently have the foundation of in the Excel Writer object that's being stored in the variable Excel file. So I'm once again going to put Excel file, which is our foundation, and I'm also going to give it a custom sheet name, and that's going to be boys. And I also want to exclude the index here. And finally, I just want to show you a couple other parameters that are available here. We have the columns parameter. Where is it? Right here. And by default, it's set to none, which exports all of the columns. Now, if I want to include only a couple of them, what I can do is provide a list to that parameter with the string names of the columns that I want to include. So let's say I want to only include gender, NM, and count. What I can do is just comma separate it and put gender, NM, and CNT. And that's basically my command. It's good to go. So I'm going to execute this. And at this point, the file still hasn't been created. It's basically created the foundation, and it's queuing these data frames up to be written. And now the final step of the process is to once again reference my Excel file object, which is actually an Excel Writer object stored in the variable Excel file. And now that I have the foundation, I have the pieces on top of it, which are my worksheets, each storing a data frame. The last thing I have to do here is call a method called save on my Excel Writer object. And finally, that's going to create the actual baby names XLSX Excel workbook for us. So now if I navigate over here, you can see baby names has appeared in my list, and this represents my Excel workbook object. Let's take a look and ensure that everything looks as it's supposed to. So I'm going to go to my Finder, and let's see, it's going to be on my desktop, pandas, there it is. Let's open this file in Excel. Here it is, baby names, just so we can confirm that everything exported as it properly should. Excuse this for a second while Excel loads. There it is. Let's expand this to a full window view. All right, so first bit of good news, we do indeed have two tabs. You can see that the sheet names have been kept. We have girls and boys. On the girls tab, we have the full data frame because we didn't specify a custom argument to the columns parameter. So here it is. You can see as well that it's even bolded the top headers for us. So the Pandas formatting does include some aesthetic quirks like that, but you can see everything is included here. And if I navigate to the boys worksheet, we can see that only the 3 columns that I specified in the columns parameter of the toExcel method, those columns were gender, name, and count, only those 3 have been included, and the index has been excluded. So as we can see, everything worked as expected, so it's really as simple as that. A little bit more complicated than the toCSV method, and the reason is fairly predictable, and that's because an Excel workbook is a lot more of a complicated object. A CSV, for example, cannot have multiple worksheets or multiple tabs. It can only have a single data set. An Excel workbook can include different worksheets with different names, so we do have to go through a more step-by-step process. But the general logic is basically the same. We just have to create an Excel Writer object, which is just going to be, the foundation of our final workbook. We then have to call the toExcel method directly on all the data frames that we want to include. In this lesson, I only did 2, but you're welcome to do as many as you'd like. Within each of those toExcel methods, you provide the argument to the sheet name parameter that specifies what you want the worksheet names to be right down here. You can also provide an argument to the index parameter if you want to exclude or include the index. And of course, a string list, a list of strings to the columns parameter if you only want to include certain columns. And finally, you conclude with that critical save method on the variable that's storing that Excel Writer object, and that finally completes the entire process. So that's how you export an Excel file from Jupyter Notebook.